right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Helena Hahn, and I'm a policy analyst in the EPC's migration program. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's policy dialogue on overcoming protection risks for non-Ukrainian asylum seekers and refugees in the European Union. The event was organized in partnership with HIAS Europe, an international NGO providing assistance and aid to refugees. And I want to use this opportunity to thank them for their fruitful cooperation. Before we hear more about the research findings and from the panelists, I'd like to invite Ilan Kohn, the director of HIAS Europe, as well as Sasha Galkin, the director of Right to Protection, which is an NGO based in Ukraine, for some brief welcome remarks. So please, Ilan, over to you.
For us to have the opportunity to launch this report here at EPC. I realized that I just spoke also with Tineke, and I realized that I have to explain, first of all, what HIAS is here in Brussels. Even though we are probably the oldest refugee agency around the world, I mean, dating back from the 80s, we began providing support to Jews escaping mostly persecution in Eastern Europe. Today, we are basically a general humanitarian organization with global reach, active in 21 countries at the moment, reaching probably around 1.5 million people annually. The current crisis in Ukraine is especially important to many of our constituents because, for example, about 4 to 5 million people that we assisted through resettlement over the years originate mostly from Eastern Europe, mostly from Ukraine and surrounding countries. So you can imagine that within our community, with our roots in the Jewish community, there's a lot of people that care deeply about the current crisis, and we are quite active in response. Also in Ukraine, where in 2001 already we established an office to start providing legal assistance to asylum seekers and refugees. In 2013, HIAS Ukraine founded the Ukrainian NGO Right to Protection, R2P. And R2P is now an independent entity with whom we are very happy to continue collaboration very closely. So from our joint experience in Ukraine, we knew basically, Ukraine as a destination as well as a transit country for people fleeing persecution around the world. We knew that these people will be particularly vulnerable in the scenario of a full-scale conflict. So indeed, early on during the conflict, we were made already aware, we all saw the images that surfaced of people being stuck at the border, mostly people with an African and Asian background, not just asylum seekers and refugees, but definitely people that look different from the Ukrainian refugees, basically. So I myself also witnessed that in a reception center in Poland, how this group was treated fairly different from the other refugees. So we got very curious what happened with them afterwards, a few months after entering the EU. And that is really how this research came about. And of course, R2P, which had a very sort of natural connection to these people because they provided services for many years. And they were basically their clients for their legal assistance program. So we owe a huge thank you to R2P for their dedicated work in collecting and analyzing the data and for their dedication, their commitment to their beneficiaries. And we're also very grateful to Meltem, İneli, Ciğer, who will be presenting very shortly the findings and who contributed her expertise on temporary protection in both law and practice. In conclusion, and before handing over to Sasha, who's unfortunately cannot be here today, as you very well realize, I haven't met him now for a year, basically, because he cannot leave Ukraine, and that's very sad. But nevertheless, he will connect online. I just would like to say that no one really would deny that the EU's response to displacement in the context of this current crisis has been rather effective. The Temporary Protection Directive has provided a lifeline to nearly 5 million Ukrainians. It indeed shows that the EU can quickly respond and respond relatively effectively to mass displacement, if only there's a political will. So, nevertheless, our research has identified that third country nationals have at times been excluded from this protection and from access to a whole range of services. And for us as humanitarians, of course, the true measure of the EU's response will be how it treats the most vulnerable in this crisis. And with this in mind, we hope that the EU and member states take heed of our recommendations embedded in this report and better protect this particular group. Handing over to Sasha.
Hello. I'm delighted to participate today in this meeting, even online. So thank you very much for the warm words, Ilan. Yes, we started many years ago as representative office of HIAS in Ukraine, and we started providing legal aid to refugees and asylum seekers, being UNHCR, being a partner to UNHCR. And at some point, we've been working with this refugee almost 20 years, and in different cities of Ukraine. We did provide not only legal aid, but also social protection. So we worked with different communities. For instance, in Kharkiv city, there was a quite big and strong Afghani community since the Soviet time, and this community cooperated with us, and we worked with them very hard. And in Lviv, for instance, we worked with Uzbek refugees, and we keep working with them. Since last year, actually, everything has changed. So, and these people had to leave Ukraine, and now we don't have even just close to this number we used to have before February 2022, but we still help these refugees and asylum seekers in Ukraine. But our clients, our beneficiaries, they left the country, and then we wanted also to support them, knowing that they are even in a worse situation sometimes in the EU compared to their situation in Ukraine during the pre-war time. So, and that's why actually, sorry, with the help of HIAS, we decided to jump into this survey and then to understand what's going on with our former and now current clients, but in the different context. So in a couple of words, who we are. Right to Protection is a charity foundation in Ukraine. We work we serve not only refugees and asylum seekers, we also deal with stateless population, which is also a forgotten population in Ukraine, with a way higher numbers than, for instance, refugees, and of course displaced and conflict affected. Now we operate more than 22 regions in Ukraine with a staff of 1,000 experts. So again, thank you very much for providing this opportunity to present our joint research, and I'll hand over the scene to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to both of you for your welcome remarks and for highlighting some of the background to your organization's respective work, and I think some useful information as well for the report. Now, this discussion comes at a time when the news continues to issue stark reminders of the ongoing war in Ukraine and the lived realities of millions of Ukrainians. And almost a year after the invasion, close to 8 million people have fled to Europe. Many of them, nearly 5 million, have become beneficiaries of temporary protection or national equivalents following the landmark decision by the EU member states to adopt the Temporary Protection Directive in early March of last year. But against this background, and as was already hinted at, today's discussion will focus on a group of persons who have to a large extent fallen through the cracks. As the new HIAS report, which you can see and find at the entrance as well as online now, as it highlights, non-Ukrainian refugees and asylum seekers are small in number, but face considerable challenges in accessing protection and rights. Not only does the report provide important information and data, it also gives us an opportunity to explore broader questions. What commonalities are there between the obstacles faced by non-Ukrainian asylum seekers and refugees and the TPD implementation as a whole? What kind of measures are needed that are targeted specifically at this group? And where can TPD implementation be harmonized to the benefit of both this group and Ukrainian nationals? And finally, what practical and policy steps need to be taken with respect to this group in the short and long run in light of the TPD regime's limited duration? We'll begin with the presentation of the findings and recommendations by two of the authors, one joining us in person and one online. And then we'll have the opportunity to hear from a person who herself was displaced again due to the war. After that, I will invite the panelists for their reactions and comments, and we'll end the event with an open Q&A. Now, I'd like to inform everyone that unfortunately, as you can see, our third speaker, Giulio Di Blasi, who's the member of the Cabinet of Home Affairs Commissioner Ylva Johansson, unfortunately is not able to join us today due to some last-minute scheduling changes. And very briefly, on housekeeping for the Q&A, I would like to ask all online participants to please submit your questions via the Q&A box. And you can do so anytime during the event. I would also like to kindly ask all persons in the room to wait until you've been handed a microphone before asking your question so that everybody online can understand you. Now, finally, please note that the event will be followed by a reception in the adjacent room, which you're of course more than welcome to join. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to two of the authors of the report. We have with us today Svitlana Butenko, who is a program manager in the legal assistance section at R2P. And then we also have online Meltem İneli, who's a Jean Monnet Fellow at the European University Institute, as well as Associate Professor at Suleyman Demirel University in Turkey. So please, over to you.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, I'm Svitlana Butenko, and I'm happy to be here and represent Right to Protection as a co-author of presenting report and research. Just to keep you informed about our activity as a refugee supporting organization in Ukraine, in general, I want to shed light on the figures relevant for 2021. R2P's active caseload at the end of 2021 was more than 1,500 beneficiaries. There were people from Afghanistan, Russia, Belarus, Syria, Nigeria, Iraq, Somalia, Eritrea, mostly men of working age, but also families with children. Despite the fact that very often Ukraine is considered as a transit country for refugees, our experience allows us to say that for a lot of our beneficiaries, Ukraine was a final destination, so-called second homeland. Logically, during 2018-2019, R2P was facilitating at least 5 refugee communities in Kyiv and 2 in Kharkiv. These are French-speaking, Arabic-speaking, Russian-speaking refugee community, as well as Afghan, Syrian, and Somalian community. In 2021, we continued the community empowerment and focused on refugee women. Therefore, it was not surprising that when Russia carried out a full-scale invasion, our beneficiaries were forced to save their life second time in their life. R2P remained for them not only the source of legal information, but also connection to their former life. During the first days of invasion, we were keeping in touch and continuing to provide assistance both those staying in Ukraine and those who went to Europe. This is how the idea of this project was born. During August-September, project team was conducting a survey of 300 beneficiaries, refugees, and asylum seekers who ended up staying in Europe, and almost 200 those remained in Ukraine. The first survey became a ground for the report we are presenting now, and the second one is being used for Ukrainian part of the report, which we are going to present and discuss with Ukrainian stakeholders spring this year. Today, attention is focused on European part of the report. So most of the respondents in Europe are men, almost half of them have children. The countries of origin of the respondents are almost the same, as I mentioned before, as R2P's beneficiaries in Ukraine. These are Syria, Afghanistan, Russia, Tajikistan, Somalia, Iraq, DRC, and some other countries. Most of them were asylum seekers in Ukraine, others persons granted complementary protection, refugees, and undocumented in Ukraine. Top 5 host countries for our beneficiaries are Germany, Netherlands, France, Sweden, Belgium. We established that more than half of all respondents were granted temporary protection in Europe. Almost a quarter reapplied for international protection, but 12% remained undocumented. Here I am to stop and give the floor to Meltem and İneli, who will describe the problems the respondents faced and provide you with direct possible recommendation for their solution. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Svitlana. Hope all you can hear me. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be presenting part of the report that I have co-authored with HIAS and R2P teams about non-Ukrainians, asylum seekers and refugees fleeing the war in Ukraine. I have a presentation as well, hope you can all see. Today, I'll be sharing some of our most important data. And as Svitlana mentioned, the report is about non-Ukrainian asylum seekers and refugees fleeing the war in Ukraine who have sought refuge in the EU. Now, although we don't know exactly how many asylum seekers and refugees who were present in Ukraine and then had to leave for the EU are, but according to UNHCR, there were nearly 5,000 refugees and asylum seekers before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began before February 2022. The objective of this report to identify protection gaps and challenges relating to this population. Although compared to, of course, Ukrainian nationals who had to flee Ukraine, the numbers are quite small. This population has really specific legal needs and challenges compared to Ukrainian nationals. They have no country of origin to return to. They have difficulties accessing travel and identity documents. And as we will see, they have perhaps facing some different challenges compared to Ukrainian nationals who are all eligible for temporary protection in the EU. Now, Svitlana mentioned this, but very briefly on our methodology. To identify these protection gaps and challenges, R2P has surveyed 300 non-Ukrainian asylum seekers and refugees who have sought protection in the EU plus countries. We also asked and received written information from Ukrainian NGOs working with this population about the challenges they face in Ukraine and the European Union. And we did an extensive review of literature and laws and practices of both European Union and the member states. So we identified 6 main protection challenges. The first one is ineligibility of a significant proportion of the non-Ukrainian asylum seekers and refugees for temporary protection. As you know, as per the Council decision dated 4th of March 2022, although refugees and complementary protection status holders in Ukraine are eligible for temporary protection in the European Union, asylum seekers cannot receive temporary protection unless they are family members of a person who is eligible for temporary protection, or they had permanent residency in Ukraine, which is rarely the case, as we know from the field, or they are applying for temporary protection in a member state that recognizes them as temporary protection. When we reviewed member state laws and policies, we realized that a number of member states, such as Spain, Portugal, and Germany, they extended the category of persons who are eligible for temporary protection, but these extended categories usually include Ukrainian nationals who have left Ukraine before the war or who were already in the member states having a permit and their permit is expiring. So rarely member states extend temporary protection status to asylum seekers in Ukraine. Therefore, nearly 40% of the surveyed respondents did not receive any temporary protection status in the member states. Second challenge is obstacles accessing temporary protection procedures. We realized that even though some of the respondents, they were holding complementary protection status in Ukraine, and they were indeed eligible for temporary protection as per the Council's implementing decision, they were rejected without a basis or just before they were informed that you do not look like Ukrainian, you are not Ukrainian, so you're not eligible for temporary protection. Some of them faced serious delays. We know from the UAA reports that being registered as temporary protection beneficiaries is done quickly in many member states for the Ukrainian nationals, though any UNHCR population that we did research on, they had to wait for months, sometimes up to 5 months to just register for temporary protection. So they were left in limbo without any status and rights. Therefore, 4 out of 10 temporary protection person, non-Ukrainian asylum seeker or refugee who were indeed eligible for temporary protection, reported obstacles in being granted temporary protection status and also receiving permits attached to this status. The third issue that we identified is that there were really shortcomings with access to information and legal advice. We know that many member states, the Commission and also the EUAA informed Ukrainian nationals in different languages that they understand about temporary protection procedures. But this population, they are not all eligible for temporary protection, and solutions, their protection statuses that they can apply, the rights that they might have, they remain uninformed. So this is one of the serious, I think, things that we identify in terms of problems. One of the pressing issues was access to identity and travel documents. Asylum seekers in Ukraine are required to surrender their passports to the Ukrainian Migration Agency, and they can only collect in person. So asylum seekers in Ukraine who have surrendered their indeed passports and travel documents and who have fled to the European Union in the first weeks following the conflict when no travel document was required, they do not have any valid travel documents now. And some of them has either expired or not valid identity and travel documents. So they cannot, or they have many difficulties re-entering Ukraine. And this is significantly important because 20% of the respondents mentioned they have family members in Ukraine. They want to see their families and relatives, but they cannot do that because either their temporary travel or identity documents are expired. They cannot cross the borders. They have problems if they manage to get into the Ukraine again. They have problems leaving Ukraine and reaching the European Union territories again because of the problems relating to documents. They have problems opening bank accounts in the member states, receiving assistance delivered by member states and sometimes local municipalities because their identity or protection status documents are not recognized. Ukrainian government does not issue any new documents for the asylum seekers, refugees, and complementary protection status holders due to capacity issues following the war. And there are serious shortcomings with asylum seekers, non-Ukrainian asylum seekers and refugees access to travel and identity documents. Our fifth finding was that similar to many Ukrainian nationals, non-Ukrainian asylum seekers and refugees faced many difficulties finding affordable housing. Now, I think in this sense, this is also similar to what Ukrainian nationals are facing in the member states because of increasing inflation and already existing housing crisis. So for 40% of our respondents mentioned that they do not have access to full housing assistance and free medical care and prescription. We also found out that those holding temporary protection status were in a more favorable position and condition compared to those who were either identified themselves as asylum seekers. And here, what is quite perhaps concerning is that due to problems with identity and travel documents, 10% of the respondents remain undocumented in the member states. And this is quite crucial to be addressed. I think also their children, and 14% of the respondents mentioned that their children do not hold any valid documents as well. This is a barrier for receiving basic rights and livelihoods. The last challenge that we identify is problem with the freedom of movement. As you all know, temporary protection beneficiaries have a right to freedom of movement before their registration for temporary protection status, and after they receive their temporary protection registration, they have a right to freedom of movement, although time limited. But only 35% of temporary protection beneficiaries among asylum seekers and refugees fleeing Ukraine can exercise this right. The reasons why they cannot exercise this freedom of movement is identified as follows. They said they either didn't know they had such a right, or because they lack travel documents, or member states might actually ask them to be present in the member states, they cannot exercise the right to freedom of movement, despite the fact that they have temporary protection status. Now, our main conclusion due to the identified obstacles is that although activation of the Temporary Protection Directive and EU's commendable efforts to protect persons fleeing war in Ukraine sadly have not fully addressed the protection challenges and vulnerabilities that non-Ukrainian asylum seekers and refugees fleeing the war has. Therefore, we recommend 6 things. We urge temporary protection to be extended to non-Ukrainian asylum seekers, considering the very small number of asylum seekers in the European Union who have fled the war in Ukraine. This is quite doable and can provide a very practical solution, because we know the number of asylum seekers who have left Ukraine is quite low, and giving them temporary protection status can actually address many of the challenges that we just identified. Secondly, we urge all non-Ukrainian asylum seekers and refugees to be given procedures and effective access to procedures, both temporary protection and asylum procedures. So without delays, without any inexplicable reasoning for rejections. Thirdly, we urge the European Union and the member states to make tailored information, legal advice, and support readily available for non-Ukrainian asylum seekers and refugees, since they have different and peculiar protection needs and challenges. Fourthly, we wish non-Ukrainian asylum seekers and refugees to access necessary documents, especially identity and travel documents, and these documents to be issued by the member states. Fifthly, we recommend access to affordable housing, healthcare, employment, and education as provided in the Temporary Protection Directive to be afforded to all non-Ukrainian asylum seekers and refugees. Finally, drafting this report has proved to be difficult in a sense that when we started, there were no data available about non-Ukrainian asylum seekers and refugees who have fled the war and sought protection in the European Union. Therefore, due respect with EU data privacy law, we want data to be collected about non-Ukrainian asylum seekers and refugees, where they come from, which status do they receive, so that tailored, effective policy responses can be adopted with in view of credible data. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoy reading our report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meltem and Svitlana, for having stuck to your time and outlining what is for sure a very rich report. I'd like to now invite Noor Kashuf to the floor. Noor is a refugee advocate who was displaced from Syria to Ukraine. And Noor, thanks for joining us and for your willingness to share your experiences with us. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Today, I want to talk about some problems I faced as a refugee from Syria leaving Ukraine. My story begins in 2011 when I sought refuge in Lebanon for the first time as a refugee. For the second time, I traveled to Ukraine in 2017 and I applied for asylum. The Ukrainian immigration took my passport, and for 2 years, the only document I had was one that needed to be renewed every 6 months. When I was finally accepted as a refugee, the refugee document they gave me was in Ukrainian language and cannot be used to travel anywhere and internationally. For 4 years later, when I had finally gotten used to safety and stability, on 2024 February of 2022, I woke up at 5 a.m. and it was the first time Russian bombs being dropped in my city, Odessa. I was so scared. I tried to leave Ukraine with my brother and my mom that same day, so we were decided to go from Odessa to Lviv. We got into a small van and we decided to travel to Germany with others from Syria, from Lebanon, from Palestine, Iraq, Egypt, and other nationalities. When we stopped in Lviv, the man who was driving the truck to pay him a money to continue. So we didn't have the money. So from the 24 until 28, we walked a lot to reach the border. Stopped in Lviv. When we finally reached didn't let us cross. They told us we couldn't leave and pushed us back to Ukraine, and they repeat every time, go back to Ukraine. Did they ask themselves where we should back to the war? So they even fired their guns into the air to scare us. We wait at the Ukrainian side of the border for a whole day without food. We slept on the floor. I saw Indians putting in and send them back to Ukraine. Finally, we met some journalists speaking English and who were filming everything, and they promised they would help us, and they would talk with the border guards and let us cross. Our problems didn't end there. When we got to the Polish border guards did not hurt us, but they kept us in a pen without toilets or food or drinks for another day. Meanwhile, all the Ukrainians were allowed to pass through in buses and cars. I was lucky enough to meet some friends and help me to cross the Polish border. 5 days later, leaving Odessa, we finally arrived in Germany. I applied for temporary protection in March. I didn't get my residence permit until 9 months later, from the 3rd of March till the 22nd of November in 2022. Although they gave me a temporary paper, I did not feel safe because it was difficult to open bank account, to apply for benefits or enroll in German classes. I felt discriminated against in Germany, even if I was protected by the Temporary Protection Directive like everyone else. For example, when we needed housing, we were redirected to the service for asylum seeker who speak Arabic, because we speak Arabic. They gave me a small apartment for me and my mother, and also 5 other persons living together. So I asked for another apartment and they ignored me. Meanwhile, my friends were able to move house when they complained. I also felt discriminated against when I started to look for work. I saw a lot of Ukrainians working, even though they don't speak German. But every time I asked for a job, they told me I needed to speak German language. I cannot deny that the war in the country of Ukraine, but people from Ukraine, your country was also my country, and I felt insecure and stable like you and more because I took refuge from two homelands. Ukraine was my homeland too. And finally, I have a right to stay in Germany until March 2024. But my worries are not over. I don't want to return back to Ukraine when the war ends, if it's not safe. If so, I would like to return to Syria. Because the Temporary Protection Directive was created for Ukrainians, it creates a lot of problems for people who were not from Ukraine but were living there when the war broke out. Like my friends, at the moment, I am thinking of applying for asylum in Sweden so I can live there permanently with my sister and her family. And I want to study there to become a flight attendant and to work with government or UNHCR in the refugee assistance field. Thanks for listening to me, and I hope my testimony helps you better understand more of the problems we are discussing today.
Thank you again, Noor. I think it indeed helped very much and complemented the presentation just beforehand. So thanks again for being here. I'd like to now turn to our panelists. It is with my pleasure to introduce to you, to my right, Tineke Strik, who is a member of the European Parliament and also a member of the Libe Committee. And to my left, we have Stefan Maier, who's the head of the Policy and Legal Support Unit here at the UNHCR representation in Brussels. Thanks again to both of you for joining us. And I'd like to invite you to share your initial reactions and comments, and we'll start with you. So please, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for this event and also for the valuable report that I was allowed to read very quickly before this event. And it's so important. Actually, Noor showed it to us with your story, how important it is to shed light on the consequences of falling outside of the scope of the TPD or falling inside, but not being treated in the same way as Ukrainian nationals. It may be a small number, but that's not a reason to overlook it. And indeed, everyone went to a traumatizing experience with the aggression in Ukraine by Russia. And indeed, for a second time, often this traumatizing experience. And many of them had already probably an insecure position before. I mean, having got a lot of challenging situations, but after the invasion, as we just also heard, their lives were completely disrupted with no safety or security of residence or no access to basic needs. And your experiences with discrimination, there was a lot of attention for that in the beginning because we heard those stories and we saw it happening, you know, on TV or internet or whatever. And the Commission guidelines were good, actually. They draw attention to it, but it appeared to me that it was very persistent, actually, very difficult to combat. And it's so important now that we hear that this discrimination is still happening. It's not only at the border of accessing or entering, but also with all, you know, other ways to get the rights, to get access to the rights that people have. So this is why it's so important to have this documented now. And I think, of course, as everyone has said, a year ago, the EU made a very hugely generous decision, but for the first time in the life of the TPD. But we really need to evaluate now to see, did we make the right decisions? Did we choose the right scope? Was it the right justification that was made with that? Should we amend the rules? But also, in case of non-compliance, what should we do? Should the Commission act enforcing the rules, enforcing compliance? We know it's really a pity that the Commission is not represented, but we know, of course, about the solidarity platform that is established with a lot of exchanges of practices between the member states. And I'm sure that the Commission is gathering information and entering into a dialogue with member states. But is that enough? I think we really need to take stock on that. Should more steps be taken to enforce compliance for everyone who is now being discriminated against? And also that non-Ukrainian refugees encounter can be lifted in practical sense. Should there be more practical guidelines or other secondary rules that could help them? And about the scope, it is of course important that beneficiaries of international protection and of equivalent national protection fall under the scope. But for instance, that asylum seekers fall outside of it, it's pretty arbitrary. I mean, it depends on the decision-making process in Ukraine, and you know, you cannot help it if the decision was not yet been taken or not. I think that many people who are in need of protection live in Ukraine, not specifically with this formal status, but maybe on a visa, maybe as a student, maybe undocumented, because of maybe difficulties in the asylum system, or maybe they thought, I just have a temporary protection need. Human rights defenders from Belarus, Russia, or many other nationalities that we just heard that are out there. So it's not so so logical that everyone would have this formal status that is now described for the scope. And of course, I can understand the reasoning behind it, that if you are an asylum seeker, you can come and enter an asylum procedure in an EU member state. But we know it's not that simple. I mean, there's no free movement, as was just said. So many people can have been stuck in the border countries. I think of Poland, Hungary, not that famous for their great accessible asylum system. Furthermore, you see that in every member state, especially after the application of the TPD, huge backlog was developed, long waiting periods, even to get access to an asylum procedure, to get proper reception needs, to reception services. So it's really difficult to have this immediately secured. And it's also important that the researchers point out there's also lack of information, of legal advice in the right languages for those people falling outside the scope. What should they do? Where could they turn to? And I'm very concerned to read also in this report, and actually also a little bit from your experiences, Noor, that even if you fall in the scope, that your rights are not secured, and you have to fight for it time after time. It's really about evaluating now if the scope should be widened, but also how to ensure that the rights of third country nationals who are entitled to TPD really have access to their rights. We have urged for the Commission to make a proper evaluation of all these aspects. And I think this report comes very timely, so it can be serve as input for this evaluation. And I will also make sure that it is part of this evaluation, so that the Commission is going to look and also look in the different member states how this group is being treated. And it's good that there are some positive examples, which you are also describing in the report. And I would hope that indeed with these solidarity platform exchanges, that some member states may be also inspired by other national practices. But I'm also concerned of the risk of the opposite effect, of a kind of race to the bottom. And let me take the Netherlands as an example. I mean, there was from the beginning a generous application of the scope. People who fell outside were still treated as TPD beneficiaries, but they decided last year to stop that, to withdraw the TPD status of third country nationals not formally or not, obligatory falling under the scope. So they lose their protection as of the 4th of March this year. And I even wonder if that's legally the right step to take, because once a member state makes use of the option to apply a more extended scope, you have to apply the whole instrument, and also with the withdrawal grounds cannot be used arbitrarily different to those people. So I hope there will be a legal procedure there as well. And a group of 25 Iranians are protesting now because they say we can't go back to our country. It's safe, it's unsafe there. And actually, they also don't want to enter an asylum procedure because they end up in a completely different situation again, with a lot of insecurity. And again, their lives is getting disrupted, and they have to start from scratch. So, yeah, thanks for gathering these data. I also understand from Meltem it is difficult to get sufficient data. This is also something that we should urge the Commission to gather, to really take that on board. And let's hope that we will get a proper evaluation and new decisions, maybe not only on the EU level, but also the national level. So I really hope that this discussion will also take place in national parliaments or with officials from member states. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Tineke. I think you covered a whole range of issues that I'm sure we'll return to in the subsequent Q&A, including on the scope, the risk of backsliding, of course, and many others. But before heading into that part of the event, I'd like to hand over to Stefan. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Many thanks to the EPC and the Right to Protection for having invited us in UNHCR to join you today. Extremely, as Tineke also said, extremely topical and on a theme that is very much eclipsed, very much neglected in many instances. I'd like to start perhaps by stressing that, broadly speaking, similar to what Ilan also said in the beginning, we in UNHCR, we have very much welcomed the Europe's response to the refugee crisis, including through the activation of the TPD, a response similar to what we have advocated for other refugee emergencies across the world, broadly speaking. So offering a good deal of inclusion, a good sense of certainly for first and foremost Ukrainian refugees. From our perspective as an international refugee agency, to advocate for access to asylum for all people in need of international protection. So regardless of their origin, regardless of the way they arrived at Europe's borders, whether they are from Ukraine, from Afghanistan, from South Sudan, or elsewhere, we consider that refugees have equal rights to protection. Now, we are just as concerned as HIAS, as Right to Protection, all protection actors with regard to this very significant gap in information on the situation of non-Ukrainian asylum seekers and refugees who fled conflict in Ukraine. I'd also like to thank you for your very illustrative and powerful testimonial. An extremely contribution that bridges this stark information gap, and that sheds light on these very numerous challenges this population group faces in the EU. So rather small population group, very vulnerable one. We have identified similar obstacles confronting non-Ukrainian asylum seekers and refugees, which are highlighted in the report. And first and foremost, according to our information, our research, the arbitrary, in many instances, arbitrary denial of access to temporary protection is something that came out strong for us as well. And this denial hindered then effective access to all other associated rights guaranteed under the TP. We have particularly observed and identified a lack of effective guidance, of effective training to first-line officials who are in charge of registration procedures is one of the driving causes of this. And as some of my previous speakers have already mentioned, the risk of the backsliding, some countries which previously had extended the application of temporary protection beyond those covered by the mandatory scope of the Council's implementing decision are now eventually reverting to a more minimum approach, very regrettably. So we continue, of course, to advocate for member states to maintain, to take a more expansive and more exclusive approach. In terms of our assessment of implementation gaps, maybe just to highlight also two key reports that we had issued, but focusing on Ukrainian refugees. First and foremost, the first report, which had captured several positive practices, and these innovative practices included advances, for instance, when it comes to digitalization, advances in the area of more integrated systems with multiple service providers under one roof, but also a more flexible approach to assessing and to documenting identity. Now, we recommend that the EU, that member states build on these experiences and where applicable, extend them to asylum procedures. Our second report of last November focused on the practical implementation of the TPD in 26 EU member states, outlining key gaps, but also formulating a number of recommendations. And among those are notably a need for increased coherence in the application of the TPD, including when it comes to granting temporary protection to non-Ukrainian asylum seekers and refugees. So our research shows that there's a clear lack of harmonization between member states, which I think also tallies and dovetails with the insights from the report we are looking at. Our research also showed that persons with specific needs are facing particularly marked obstacles in attempting to effectively access their rights. And here, an early and a systematic identification of persons with specific needs would be an essential step towards promoting an effective protection and effective access to rights. Importantly, refugees themselves have also demonstrated to be an asset to host communities. They can help solve challenges around effective access to rights. Now, let me still briefly turn to the specific situation of stateless persons, which had also already been referred to by Alexandra. Now, just to recap, as we know, the TPD provides member states with the opportunity to extend temporary protection to stateless persons. However, with two important qualifications: the prerogative of member states to decide whether they wish to apply the TPD or adequate protection under national law. And second, the TPD only extending to stateless persons who held a permanent residence permits. And that's exactly where the crucial protection gap stems from, knowing that the majority of stateless persons from Ukraine do not hold any documents, which is, however, required for obtaining a permanent residence permit. So we consider, therefore, that there is a clear need for temporary protection to be extended to apply to the majority of stateless persons. And perhaps to also reference what are the key risks faced by stateless persons. First of all, an increased risk of detention due to lack of proof of identity, lack of proof of nationality, country of origin, but also greater restrictions on freedom of movement. And this is compounded by a significant lack of data on the nationality status of persons fleeing to Ukraine. And this prevents a sound and well-informed assessment as to whether stateless persons have been able to leave Ukraine, have been able to apply for temporary protection or access to other forms of protection. So yeah, we from UNHCR, we're certainly very hopeful that your new report will generate this additional and much needed awareness for an otherwise often eclipsed problem and issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'd like to start with one question which relates to something that was mentioned on the top of both of your interventions, which relates to the scope. Now, of course, it was mentioned by the presenters that they're advocating for a general expansion. But my question to the panelists, and of course, Meltem, please also feel free to come in, and Svitlana as well, is whether in your view, and also in light of the ongoing debates around migration reform in the EU, whether you think that going forward there should be a general expansion, or if you think that also in light of the data that was shared, that targeted measures, so measures targeting individual member states that appear to have difficulties in granting protection to non-Ukrainian asylum seekers and refugees, would perhaps be more effective. Perhaps I can make a start with you, Tineke.
So that's more a strategic question, actually. How can we get a more generous application of the TPD, right? Yeah, maybe the easy answer is we should do both, because I'm not sure if we will get a change of the Council implementing decision before 4th of March 2025, because it was made, it is now being extended. I don't see them returning to the negotiation table on this instrument. It was already a huge surprise that they were having such a unanimous decision, but I don't think it's likely that they are going to reopen this. And who knows, maybe reopening would not be a good idea. You don't know if it would also lead to some deterioration in other situations. So I think realistically, you'd better focus on the member states level because they have the possibility to do so. So I think it's a matter there of having sufficient knowledge, creating sufficient knowledge of the practical problems that everyone encounters, and also trying to increase political pressure. And, there are different arguments that can be used, of course. They are in the same situation as the Ukrainians, also as those with a formal refugee status. They cannot go back, and it's a very small number. Maybe pragmatically speaking, it should not, be subject to a huge migration debate or whatever in member states. It's really, if we really approach it as a very practical issue with huge humanitarian consequences for a small group of people, through NGOs, churches, maybe ombudsman, really different institutes in a member state, maybe that could help the best. And of course, I already mentioned the Solidarity Platform. It could be good if the Commission would be willing to organize a specific meeting on this topic. To try to convince member states also that they should use their discretion to solve these problems.
Thanks very much, Stefan.
Thanks. Yes, very much along the lines of Tineke. I think that indeed, or my hunch is that for now, not realistic or perhaps desirable in terms of possible negative consequences, not to be ruled out to be reopening the current council implementing decision, but rather work around the practical implementation of it, and perhaps also make an additional strong case to states that with such a patchwork of practices, non-harmonized practices, and groups of people coming from the very same country, i.e. Ukraine, perhaps in many respects, easier to administer and easier to tackle from a state vantage point through a more expansive application of the TPT rather than fostering directly or indirectly these diverging practices. And we in UNHCR, together also with our UN colleagues in IOM, we are privy to the different three principal Ukraine response coordination fora under the auspices of the Commission, but also led by the Council presidency when it comes to the integrated political crisis response mechanism. And indeed, generally speaking, we have seen a very good move in terms of the different Commission services, member states coming together around thematic policy areas. And I think re-echoing also what Tineke and yourself were referring to earlier, certainly room and potential for more resolutely also placing this issue to the attention of all the constituents in the Solidarity platform, which after all reaches to the 27 member states with good possibility to further amplify, to further reinforce.
Thank you so much. I have many more questions to ask myself, but I would be very happy to invite all audience members to please ask your questions. I have a couple coming in online as well. I'll be taking 2 or 3 at a time. I see one hand over here. So I'd be happy to give you the floor first. And if you could please introduce yourself briefly by stating your name and affiliation. Thank you.
Hi. It works. My name is Helena. I'm from Ekre, and I wanted to briefly ask, and the question would be directed to Svitlana and Meltem, probably, who carried out the research. It's a bit legalistic. I wanted to ask, because temporary protection provides that there could be another adequate protection for third country nationals or stateless persons. And I wanted to ask whether you had among the respondents, people who declared that they received another adequate protection, and what was it? And did they receive maybe humanitarian stays or tolerated stays or anything as such? Or everyone was directed to asylum proceedings? Thank you.
Thank you, Rina, for this question. As far as I remember,
sorry, I'll just be taking 2, 3 questions at a time and then circle back to everyone. Yeah, okay. Please, over to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tommy Kalmel, working for IOM. And I had a question, actually. So first of all, thank you very much for the very insightful report, very informative. I was wondering, looking at, because Stefan was mentioning also an increased risk of detention and looking at the use of administrative detention, I was wondering if the report was also looking at the extent to which some of the people were placed in detention. Because I mean, from our side, we have heard, reports of people being placed in administrative detention custody in some instances in some countries. So I was wondering if the report was looking at these aspects as well, or if you have any insights on that. Thank you.
Thank you. And I have one more question coming in from the online audience, which is on what kind of concrete support, i.e. material or financial, could the EU give to refugees on the spot in light of the fact that member state practices continue to diverge? I'm looking around the room, and perhaps we can start with Svitlana, and then Meltem, and then Stefan and Tineke. So please, Svitlana, over to you.
First of all, I'm going to cover the question from Irina Sekre. I think it was this question. As far as I remember, our beneficiaries say that they were granted temporary protection, or they reapplied for international protection, or they have, like you are mentioned today, this like a period of waiting to have any document for their status. That is why I can't give the direct answer about the humanitarian status, because no one mentioned it, as far as I remember. Yeah, and as for detention cases, if we talk only about the reporters during the respondents of this report, as well, almost no one mentioned detention. But if we talk about experience right to protection, I know at the beginning of our phase, we were contacted by our beneficiaries who were detained in Poland, and we communicate with other organization partners of UNHCR, including Poland, just to provide them as quickly as possible communication with attorney. And there were some other questions about extradition for asylum seekers who came to other countries. As far as I remember, it was also Poland. Yeah.
Thanks. Meltem, would you like to take the floor next?
Sure, thank you very much. I will start with Irina's question. And so when you look at Annex 2 of the report, you will see the statuses that the respondent received. And here, and I'm quoting, nearly, and the decimals are erased. So if there are some differences and they do not exactly add up to 100, that's the reason we didn't put the decimals here. Nearly 61% is now holding temporary protection. 1% is recognized as a refugee in the European Union. 23% are now registered as temporary protection, asylum seekers, and 12% remain undocumented. None of our respondents actually mentioned they received another status. And I think this may be because councils are implementing decision, as from Maier, I'm sure you already know, is to be under the council's implementing decision is to be afforded to those who are holding permanent resident status in Ukraine and who cannot go back to the country or region of origin in a safe and durable manner. What we realized with working with R2P and Ukrainian researchers is that nearly none of the asylum seekers in Ukraine have any permanent residence. That's the thing about perhaps refugees, but refugees, although they already fall within the scope of temporary protection, so asylum seekers never nearly gets permanent residence in Ukraine. That's why it's a bit, for asylum seekers, this is not really affording any protection, them either being eligible for adequate protection or temporary protection. So I hope this is a very good question, and this is a response to your question. Tommy's questions about detention. So 99% of the respondents mentioned that they weren't arrested or detained in the borders when they arrived to the EU, and that's, I think, a positive outcome, although one of the respondents mentioned that he has been denied entry or harassed because he didn't look like Ukrainians and in some borders, and we included that in the report. And finally, I think the third question was about what can be done to make sure non-Ukrainian asylum seekers and refugees receive the support that they need. I mean, this is also discussed, and I think this brings us back to the first question that Tineke and Stefan just addressed. I also think that ideally EU should extend temporary protection to asylum seekers in Ukraine, but we also know that this is not very realistic in a sense that we don't see soon the Council's implementing decision to be amended. And for me, this would be the most practical solution. The problem with member states extending protection to other groups is that when I started writing this report, it was around, I think, October. And when I finished the first draft, member state laws and policies actually extended temporary protection to more people. And in the second draft, I realized that some of the member states' laws has changed. So I had to just update the report in a sense that they got more restricted. So as Tineke mentioned in the Netherlands, for instance, because this is discretionary power, member states might feel free to take it back, and there's no guarantee in that. I think that's the reason I think the EU supranational response might be the best, but it might not be politically viable. So the support should come from the EU, of course, to meeting basic needs of persons fleeing both Ukrainian and non-Ukrainian nationals. We know that member states have really worked towards addressing these needs, and the number of displaced persons is serious. It's nearly temporary protection beneficiaries reaching 5 million now, and more support, more cash aid, as UNHCR's also conclusions show us that both Ukrainians and non-Ukrainian nationals need cash assistance, humanitarian aid, and social assistance, and it is crucial. And a final point, I think I have seen in many questions in the chat that it is being asked whether we have covered detention of third country nationals and stateless persons in Ukraine, and how many they are, how many detained. The responses, I'm sure Svitlana might also contribute, that there's a coming report from HIAS and R2P about third country nationals, asylum seekers and refugees in Ukraine, and the problems and the protection challenges they face inside Ukraine. And this is a very good report. I have had the pleasure to read it, and I'm sure once you read it, you will learn more about the situation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meltem. Stefan, over to you.
Thanks. Maybe just to pick out the question around possible additional EU support on the spot. Here, of course, among other things, the role of the EU Asylum Agency also comes to the fore. And knowing the extent to which, according to our information, the lack of effective guidance and training to first-line officials when it comes to administering the eligibility considerations and scope considerations for TP, that's perhaps something where an EU agency could provide support for to member states. The identification of special needs and improving procedures around that, perhaps another area where we would see a more room for the EU and its agencies to help, and the data collection, the manifold gaps that are among the things that are really at the core also of the issue being quite eclipsed. So more support when it comes to thoroughly collecting information that would then yield the necessary insights to further build on. Thanks.
Very briefly, because I think everything is covered already, but I was thinking of for EU support, the funding issue, of course, is vital. And I can imagine, I'm not sure, but if a member state has extended the scope, that the projects or the support to these groups also fall under the funding provided for by the Commission. And I can imagine, I don't know, maybe you could say something for ECRA that maybe also refugee organizations on a national level could sit together with governments, with ministries to see what are the specific needs for the refugees among the TPD beneficiaries, and could there be projects to give specific attention or support. I think it could be that in this way, member state would be willing to cooperate and that there is funding available, although there's a lot of funding issues, of course. I mean, we also put a lot of pressure on the Commission to make it more flexible so that there is more possibility for specific projects and whatever. I think that should also be evaluated. And of course, you are depending on cooperative authorities. I mean, this is, for instance, in Poland and Hungary, of course, a persistent problem. But, it might help. I don't think that member states are going to do it, voluntarily immediately themselves. So they could be helped with this report and with specific actors on the national level.
Indeed, I think your point on flexibility is very much to the point, because I mean, all these all the additional funding was introduced with this promise that there would be a more flexible use, and so it's really I think important to follow up on the practical implementation of use and use of this generous funding. I'd like to see if anybody else in the room has any questions. If so, please feel free to raise your hand. If not, there are also some more in the chat. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Catherine. I'm from HIAS Europe here in Brussels. Thank you everyone for your really useful interventions. I wanted to pick up on the point about guidance at EU level, because we saw the operational guidelines published in March last year, and they mention that it's also pragmatic on a member state level to be extending temporary protection to people who fled Ukraine prior to the 24th of February, but also this was mentioned more broadly, that the broader the scope, the less people are redirected to asylum systems, the less burden on those systems. But when these guidelines were published, they were presented by the Commission as a living document, and it was suggested, or at least implied, that they would be updated as challenges arose. 11 months on, we haven't seen that. Maybe we've seen some challenges addressed via the Solidarity platform, but I would like to put a question out if we have any online attendees from the Commission or anybody in the room who would like to offer an answer, but also to our panelists, because unfortunately our Commission representative wasn't able to join us today. Just whether there is a role in the publication of further guidance, whether that would be useful, and which issues that could cover. We've also seen from a whole range of issues identified for Ukrainians themselves, like returns and freedom of movement, that could be the subject of secondary guidance. Thank you.
Yeah, please, over to you.
Hi, my name is Victoria Vajtovic, and I'm a policy officer at ECRA. Thank you very much for all of your very valuable insights, and thank you for the very interesting report that was presented today. I have, in fact, two questions, and I believe that they would have been best addressed again to the colleague from the Commission. It's indeed a pity that he was not able to join us today, but I still would like to hear your opinion on the 2 points. The first one is about the Solidarity platform that has been mentioned so many times today. And I would like to hear from the colleagues who take quite an active role there, to my knowledge, particularly from the UNHCR, perhaps also from the IOM, to what extent you believe the voices of the civil society and Ukrainian diaspora are included in the platform, because I believe that this issue that we discussed today, among many others, could be very well also brought up in this platform. And the second question is about the data collection, which has been also mentioned today as one of the biggest one. While moving forward, we still have to understand actually the state of play. Again, while the efforts of the UNHCR in understanding the implementation at the member states level are very much welcome, on ECRA sides, we are also very much looking forward to our asylum information database that this year will feature the Temporary Protection Directive section. But I would like to hear from you, in your opinion, do you believe that the full implementation report by the European Commission can be one of the very important resources for understanding this information? And do you think that the hopes can be placed, on this perspective? Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much for your questions. I'll add just one more, and then we'll go in reverse order. So starting with you, Tineke. So there's a question in the online audience with regards to the divergent opinions on whether the TPD should be part of the acquis in the future. There are proposals in the pipeline for including a revamped form of temporary protection in the crisis and force majeure regulation. What is the opinion of the panel on this? Should the TPD directive be retained or reformed? Big questions, but yeah, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I feel a bit humble because I'm not the Commission, so it's I'm afraid I'm not so useful in this regard. But definitely, I really share your need for both implementation report and guidance, and I think the two should come together. I think we need much more transparency on the way member states perform, and also conclusions from the Commission if they think it's in compliance with the TPD. And then come accompanied by guidance on how things should be interpreted or improved. I mean, it's great that Solidarity Platform is the first time, of course, that the Commission has such a coordinating role in the implementation, but it needs to be opened up because you never know if member states give all the information. That's one, and others need to know as well. For instance, to inform beneficiaries, to have information for litigation, for instance, for so many things, to put more pressure, political pressure, on governments to improve their practices and policies. So, in that sense, the Commission could also be helped with opening up. So that's not only the Commission, but there are also on a national level, different actors moving or pushing in the same direction. So we asked for this implementation report, but I don't know when it will come. But definitely we cannot wait another year. I mean, so many things are happening and so little is known that it should come quickly. So yeah, that's one thing. Also with guidance, I really agree. It was a living instrument, and we don't know what the Commission exactly advises, in those exchanges to the different member states. So we should, of course, know. And also for judges, if they in the end need to interpret the TPD, they need to know what the Commission thinks, because that's second best, actually, if you don't have case law of the Court of Justice, which we still lack, of course. So yes, definitely. And I think it's a very good idea if civil society would also take part in these exercise. I don't know how. Maybe indeed Stefan could say more about this. But they can bring up the problem issues, maybe sometimes even more than the governments can do or officials can do themselves. Now, the last question was, should it be reformed or repealed? Well, this is, of course, a very tricky thing that it's still on the table, the repealing the TPD. We are now in the Parliament negotiating on a Parliament's position on the crisis regulation. The rapporteur has proposed to indeed repeal the TPD, but luckily there's a majority for the moment that says, no, we should not do that. And I think it would be a very unwise decision to do so now that millions of people rely on the protection of it. And in the most ideal case, we would have a thorough evaluation and then look up how could we reform the TPD. Again, I don't see that immediately happening. I mean, the Council is still really pushing for having another instrument besides the TPD that they could apply more easily than the TPD. So maybe the best thing would be if the TPD would remain, and that we manage to have a good other regulation, complementary instrument that could be applied, triggered more easily than the current TPD.
Thanks for what is, I think, a lot of food for thought. Stefan, I'd be happy to turn to you next.
Thank you very much. So indeed, I can also not substitute for the Commission, but yes, clearly the room for further adapting guidance would be something to be welcomed. We had back in at the time of the issuance of the operational guidance welcomed it as directions going into the right directions issued pointing to the right steer, to the right orientations in terms of flexibility has been mentioned, pragmatism, also going beyond a minimum approach, all of which we very much agree with. So I can't tell what is in the pipeline currently in terms of readaptations or readjustments of these various sets of guidance documents, but certainly to be welcome to and yet another venue to perhaps factor in some of the issues we are discussing today. And same for the implementation report. Yes, something potentially very valuable and useful, but not sure where this currently stands. When it comes to the civil society inclusion / attendance of solidarity platform meetings, yes, there have been targeted sessions at which civil society representatives have had the chance to contribute, as have Ukrainians, along also with municipal authorities, for instance, so beyond the national member state level. But these have remained for now targeted sessions. So perhaps, but of course, for the Commission, first and foremost, to consider further diversifying, opening up the composition of these meetings from our perspective, also something we would certainly concur with. On the tricky question in a quite fluid legislative current context in terms of the TPT vis-a-vis other instruments, the crisis force majeure regulation proposal has been mentioned. So I suppose for us, for now, we welcome the TPT serving as a protective instrument, as a protective measure. There are several pros, but also perhaps flip sides when it comes to the crisis regulation proposal. So, for instance, in terms of the positives that could flow from it, there are several rights that are attached to it that could be stronger than the ones in the Temporary Protection Directive. It might also be easier to trigger, so the immediate protection as it's provided for in the crisis regulation proposal. However, let's also not forget that this proposal comes with a wide range of derogations, including the extension of detention, suspension of registration, and also the fact that beneficiaries of the so-called immediate protection do not fall within the scope of the Family Reunification Directive. So a number of also concerns around this proposal. So I would say no final conclusive feedback from us for now, but encouraging the TPT to continue being the reference instrument and progressing work on the pact files and hopefully arriving at a more sustainable and protection-oriented asylum system.
Thanks very much for your comprehensive response. I would like to turn to Meltem next to see if she has any additional comments.
Right, thank you. Great questions and comments. So about catchment points, I also think it's a very good idea because we know the first time operational guidelines is issued by the Commission, it actually filled some gaps that Temporary Protection Directive has, and in terms of procedures, in terms of how to prevent human and child trafficking. So we had some really useful guidance. I think it's very important to have this continue and also address newest challenges. So the only thing is it's only advisory and it's not really binding on member states. So there's always with this kind of soft law, perhaps, or approach to that, member states are free to not follow it. But of course, this is also a useful way to fill some gaps in the Temporary Protection Directive. Victoria's question, I'm afraid I cannot add much more, and Tineke and Stefan already addressed. And final question, I think I should perhaps address this question as an academic who has been working on Temporary Protection Directive now. I just counted 12 years. So I have very strong opinion about this question. So not as a consultant to HIAS, but as an academic myself, I can say that repealing Temporary Protection Directive is a very bad idea. I have voiced this concern to rapporteurs when I was meeting the shadow and rapporteurs to the force majeure regulation proposal. I also mentioned in the LIBE committee meeting when I presented about the Temporary Protection Directive, I think it's a very bad idea. Of course, it has some shortcomings and gaps, and they should be addressed perhaps once, hopefully, the Russian aggression ends and temporary protection regime ends. It should be updated because it's an instrument adopted in 2001 when there was no CIAS nearly. So it should be updated and the gaps should be addressed, but repealing it and replacing it with an immediate protection status, which is a very narrowed down scope, 1 year time limit, is not a good idea. And that's perhaps my personal, very subjective opinion on the matter. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Meltem. Svitlana, do you like to add anything else?
I'm happy that we have in our team for this project so permanent academic with perfect background and experience. That's why I'm totally agree with your opinion.
Well, thank you very much. It is now just past 5, which means we have come to an end. I'd like to thank all our speakers for joining us today and for sharing your insights and tackling what are tricky questions. I'd also like to thank our partners again at HIAS for their cooperation, as well as R2P and the authors for joining us today. And I'd also like to acknowledge my colleague Anastasia Karatsas for her invaluable support in putting together all the pieces that are needed for an event like this. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you in the audience for your interest and your engagement in what is no doubt a topic that will require further reflection and discussion. The migration program, as well as the EPC as a whole, have intensified their work around EU and Ukraine relations. We have an event coming up on February 6th relating to war crimes, and I would encourage all of you to continue to keep an eye out for more events this coming spring. Thank you again for your interest, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. Bye.